Okay, so what we're going to do today is go through how it is that we go about presenting rebuttal during a case. Now obviously, depending on where you speak in the debate is going to change how it is that you go about rebuttal and refutation, but there are some general ideas that are very, very important that we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things. I'm going to talk about the don'ts of rebuttal and refutation, 5 things you definitely shouldn't do. Then I'm going to talk to you about how it is that we actually structure rebuttal within a debate itself. So let's start with rebuttal and refutation. So a couple of golden rules about rebuttal. But before we do that, what do we mean by rebuttal? And what do we mean by refutation? So, often people don't distinguish between the two. They use the word rebuttal to talk about both rebuttal and refutation. However, they do have somewhat different meanings. Rebuttal is about defending your own case. So if we use the blue marker, rebuttal is about defending your case. So that's when they attack you, your ability to be able to respond and be able to defend the material, the positive material that you put on the table. Refutation then is attacking. It's attacking their case. So things that are wrong with what the last speaker just said, the things that they wanted to say are true that you guys think are not true. A good case will have to have both rebuttal and refutation in it. So, given that we have both the positives of attacking their case and the negatives of defending your own case, obviously we're responding to what other people have said. So, there are 4 things that we don't do. Before we're going to talk about what we should do, let's talk about what we don't do. The first one that's really, really important is you must structure your rebuttal. So, when we're talking about rebuttal, people often think that it's just a chance to say whatever random things you want to say at the other team, to just basically shopping list a whole bunch of responses that you have to them. But rebuttal needs to still have very, very good structure, and it still needs to be very easy to follow. And the reason for that is because debating at its core is trying to persuade the adjudicator that what you're saying is right and what they're saying is wrong. And in order to be able to do that, you have to be able to have the adjudicator to be able to follow what you're saying. That means that the adjudicator has to understand what point of theirs you're wanting to respond with, and then very clearly what you think is different from them. All too often, when people are rebutting, they forget that they're actually trying to tie it into a cohesive case. They forget that they're trying to persuade the adjudicator of a certain point. Being able to be easy to follow makes it so much easier for the adjudicator to understand what you're saying. And a little bit later on, I'm going to go through how it is that we structure that rebuttal. But that's number 1. So things that you don't do are shopping list. So shopping list rebuttal is when you just basically have a whole list of things that they said and why you disagree with it and you think it's wrong. That's not good. And we'll talk about that in just a second. The second big thing that we need to watch out for when we're rebutting is rebutting rebuttal. This is a big no-no. So, the overarching point when you are rebutting an argument is you're trying to tear down either what they have said or you're trying to defend your own case. What you don't do is take a response that they had to some little point and then give yourself your own little point in exchange. The reason why that's true is because you forget your own case. You start digging into such little intricacies that you actually forget about what the broad thing was that you were trying to prove. So we don't rebuttal. This will make sense more in just a second when we go through an example. The third thing that you always want to do is rebut the issues. And this is sort of tied to our second point. So, people often fall into the trap of hearing a throwaway fact that the opposition said that they disagreed with, or an opposition statistic that came out and they were like, no, it's not 65%, it's 75%, right? Here's the problem. When you do that, you forget to actually argue the broad issue that's behind it. You forget that you're actually trying to persuade someone of an idea. You're trying to be persuasive about that idea. And when you just simply throw away a fact, it doesn't really prove anything, because unless you're proving that the analysis behind that statistic or the analysis behind that fact is correct or incorrect, you're not going to win the case. So we don't waste time rebutting intricate points. We instead focus it on the broad issues. So it could be things like the principled issues. Or it could be a practical issue. But either way, it needs to be big and it needs to be in our face. The fourth point then, the fourth thing that we never do is rebut with our own case. So it's not good enough when you're providing refutation to simply say, they said this, but we said this, therefore we are right. It's important that you directly prove why the argument that they brought out is wrong on its own level. So it's not good enough, oh, that's broken. It's not good enough to simply restate your own point. Alright, so these are the 4 golden rules of rebuttal. What we're going to do now is we'll start going through how it is that we can actually use this in real life, because I recognize that a lot of that won't make sense in the abstract. So, let's take a hypothetical case. Let's say the topic is that we should ban cosmetic surgery. And we have an affirmative team who has argued, firstly, that people cannot consent. And secondly, that, let's see, they say that people can't consent because they are mentally ill, or because of body dysmorphia, or because society is pressuring them. And then secondly, they argue that there's a social reason. So we might say, for instance, that there's a concept of beauty in society that's bad. For instance, to be thin, to look a certain way. And that the problem with cosmetic surgery is that it buys into that. So, that's a very simple case that you might get from a government team. Now, what we want to do on the opposition here is we want to come up with our arguments. So, how do we do that? The first thing that's very important is making sure that we have our structure down packed. So, let's say we are the opening opposition speaker, or the leader of the opposition. That means that we are the second speaker in the debate. So we want to rebut these 2 big points that the Prime Minister's come out with. How do we do it? Okay, the first thing that we want to do is we want to structure our rebuttal around these big ideas. So you don't want to be saying, this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong. What you want to be saying is, ladies and gentlemen, I will have two issues in rebuttal. Firstly, on the issue of can people consent? And then secondly, on the issue of whether there are social harms. So what you're doing is you're taking the labels of the first speaker's speech, where that point's well made, and you're using that to label your own rebuttal. So if I'm an adjudicator, I'm looking at what you're doing and I'm saying, aha, he is now responding to this argument that was made by the Prime Minister. It allows the adjudicator to be able to directly compare. Because it's very, very important to argue the strongest parts of the opposition speech. Some people have this weird idea that somehow if you ignore the strong stuff and you just attack, the really, really weak and easy to argue things, that's good, but definitely not. Definitely you need to take down the strongest material if you want to win a debate. So, let's go after it. So now what are we doing? What we want to do is we want to have subsets in our structure. So you might say, Mr. Speaker, on the first issue of whether they can consent, there were three points came out. And you go, okay, the first thing that they told us is that these people are mentally ill. So what I have done there is I have flagged for the adjudicator that is the point that I'm going to be responding to under this point. So on the first issue of can they consent, they told us that they are mentally ill. We say that it is ridiculous to say that everybody who wants to go into cosmetic surgery are mentally ill. But it's not enough just to say that. You can't just say, and they're wrong. You need to back that up. We say that it's perfectly reasonable for somebody to want to get cosmetic surgery because perhaps they simply do not like the way that they look. That perhaps, do not like the way they look. Or perhaps you want to go even more hardline. You say it might be true that a wife in a marriage wants to change her body because it'll make her husband happier. We think even that is a totally rational decision for somebody to make, if that's something that they want to do. So what you've done is you've now responded with specific counter-examples that disprove the contention that they are mentally ill because they do it. And the way you're doing that is you're showing that there are rational ways in which somebody could want to go into that. So that's very important. So now we've discussed that first issue. The other thing that you'll notice is that we haven't spent a long time labouring over the point. We've been very direct and very sharp. Rebuttal and refutation must be very quick. So the second thing we might say then is, giving ourselves a bit more room, on the idea that society oppresses them. You say, well, they told us that society oppresses them because it creates a certain idea of what is beautiful that you then necessarily have to buy into. So, there's a number of ways that we could rebut this. The first thing that we could do is we could deny that that's true. So we could say that our first response to that is, no, we don't think the society does oppress. And we could say, actually, there are many different ideas of what's beautiful in society, and nobody owns that first one. Then, we use what's a very, very, very important tool in rebuttal. This is fundamental. Even if they are right on that point, they are wrong on the next point. So, even if it is true that society does have a certain overarching concept of beauty, we still don't think that that means that there is a social harm that's bad. And you say, we think that it's rational for someone to conform to society. So what you're doing now is you're taking their analysis and you're throwing it back at them. You say, if it is true that society has a certain perception of beauty that means that these women want to change the way they look, we say that that's a perfectly legitimate decision. Why? Because there's benefits to that. If it's true that there's an overarching perception of beauty, this makes them more beautiful. It makes them feel better. So, what we've done in rebuttal then is we've gone through their case, we've quickly shown the adjudicator the major points of that case. And the first reason why that's very important is because you're showing that you understand what the important points of their case are. You need to be able to fish through and find what the overarching concepts and the overarching ideas of that case is. Then what we're doing is using those ideas, which we're giving responses, direct responses to what's happening here. And we're using our even ifs. Where there are more than one response that can be had, that's more, all the better. The more responses you can get, the better you're going to go for it. So, given that, how is it that we're structuring this rebuttal? Alright, so what we can see here is that we've got our first line of rebuttal, and then our second point. So, Your Honour, Mr. Speaker, our first point of rebuttal was that individuals can consent, and our second point of rebuttal was that society does not oppress, and even if it does, that's more rational for the individual. Now, what am I going to tell you in substantive? So, it's important to then round off your rebuttal and summarize your rebuttal. In other words, you need to, in every part that you're structuring, whether it's a positive material or it's rebuttal, it's important to do three things. 1, tell them what you are going to tell them. 2, tell them. 3, sorry, that's terrible. 3, tell them what you told them. So, introduce your case by explaining to the adjudicator what the major points are going to be. Secondly, explain what those points are in rebuttal. So explain what they told us and then explain what our response is. And then thirdly, tell them what it is that you just explained to them. Okay, so the last thing that we might do then is very quickly go through some of the major things that we can go through. So, if we look at this case here, some of the things that we rebutted actually came down to a couple of broad concepts that come up again and again. So, for instance, the first thing that you might want to rebut, the principle of the case. So, for instance, in this debate about cosmetic surgery, the broad principle is that the government can ban when people can't consent or if there's social harms. So, we may want to attack that principle. We might want to say, actually, that principle is wrong. We stand for a different principle. The principle on the negative side of this case might be individual autonomy. So, I have the right to do things. Now, in terms of consent, that may not be something that's directly rebuttable. But in terms of the social harms, it might be. Even if there are social harms, you don't have the right to stop me doing what I want to do with my body. So you have a countervailing principle. That's something that you rebut. So the principle could be very important. And it often is very, very important to rebut. The second thing then are practical harms. Does that happen? Maybe it plays out a lot differently. Maybe the harms that they wanted to say are untrue. What's very, very important is you don't want to just rebut to mitigate the harms. You need to be rebutting to actually be opposing them. So sometimes you might want to just mitigate the extent of damage. So for instance, if they say that lots of people will go overseas if we introduce cosmetic surgery, you might just want to be able to prove that not so many will. That it's not a very rational decision to go to Thailand to get surgery because it's cheaper. Instead, you want to stay in like the countries where even though it's more expensive, there's better regulations around it. The second thing that you might want to do though is deny that harm exists at all. And perhaps maybe even contend that it's a benefit. So they could say, well, it's very, very harmful that women are getting cosmetic surgery because it means that they're buying into the idea of beauty. But you might say that that's actually beneficial, that it's important for people to be able to understand how they can fit into society and how they can conform. So you take what they say as a negative and you defend it as a positive. These are all ways in which we can rebut cases. Obviously, there's an incredibly large more amount of things that we can talk about, but that's it for today. So thanks.